Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's news story is He Anointed Kings, Judged Nations, and Shaped History. The Untold Story of Samuel. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For more than 3,000 years, the name Samuel has stood at one of the greatest turning points in biblical history. He was born from the tears of a desperate mother. He heard the voice of God as a child when an entire nation seemed to have forgotten how to listen. He witnessed the collapse of an old era, guided Israel through spiritual renewal, anointed its first king, and later helped prepare the rise of its greatest king. Yet, despite his extraordinary influence, Samuel is often overshadowed by the famous names that came after him, Saul and David. But what if the story of Israel's transformation did not begin with the king at all? What if it began with a boy sleeping in the sanctuary at Shiloh? To understand how Israel moved from chaos to kingdom, from judges to monarchs, and from national crisis to a new chapter of history, we must first understand the remarkable life of the man who stood at the center of it all. This is the complete story of Samuel. Long before Samuel was born, Israel was a nation living through a period of uncertainty, unlike anything it had experienced since entering the Promised Land. The great victories of Joshua belonged to the past. The generation that had witnessed the conquest of Canaan had disappeared, and the unified sense of purpose that once held the tribes together was gradually fading. What remained was a loose confederation of tribal communities, scattered across the hills, valleys, and plains of ancient Israel. Although they shared a common ancestry and covenant tradition, they did not function as a centralized kingdom. There was no royal capital, no standing army, and no permanent national government capable of responding quickly to external threats. Each tribe largely managed its own affairs, and cooperation often depended on circumstance rather than established institutions. For a time, this system survived, but as new challenges emerged, its weaknesses became increasingly difficult to ignore. The biblical period, known as the era of the Judges, was shaped by this fragile reality. The Book of Judges describes a recurring pattern that defined much of Israel's experience during these generations. Periods of stability were repeatedly interrupted by invasion, oppression, internal conflict, and social disorder. Foreign powers exploited tribal divisions. Local leaders rose and fell. Temporary deliverers emerged during moments of crisis, only for many of the underlying problems to return after their deaths. The result was a society that struggled to build lasting unity. Modern historians often describe early Israel during this period as a decentralized tribal federation, rather than a fully developed state. Archaeological evidence from the Central Hill Country suggests the existence of numerous small settlements connected by shared culture and religious traditions, yet lacking the political structure commonly found in neighboring kingdoms. While surrounding nations increasingly consolidated power under kings and royal administrations, Israel remained politically fragmented. This difference would eventually become one of the most important issues in the nation's history. Yet political instability was only part of the problem. The deeper crisis involved identity. Israel's existence was built upon a covenant relationship established centuries earlier. According to biblical tradition, the nation had been called to live differently from the surrounding peoples. However, maintaining that distinct identity proved difficult. The land of Canaan was filled with competing religious systems, local deities, fertility cults, and cultural practices that often attracted the Israelites. Over time, many communities began blending elements of neighboring religions with their own traditions. This process did not always involve abandoning their heritage completely. More often, it involved compromise, gradual adaptation, and divided loyalties. The danger was not simply theological. Religious beliefs shaped moral values, social structures, and political decisions. As covenant commitments weakened, so did the foundations that held the nation together. The Book of Judges summarizes this condition through one of the most famous observations in the Old Testament. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The statement is often interpreted as a comment about government, but it reaches much deeper than politics. It describes a society lacking a shared moral center. Without common direction, communities increasingly relied upon personal judgment, local interests, and immediate concerns. The result was not freedom in the ideal sense, but fragmentation. The closing chapters of Judges portray violence, civil conflict, and social breakdown severe enough to raise questions about the future of the nation itself. Against this backdrop stood Shiloh, one of the most important religious centers in Israel. Located in the hill country of Ephraim, Shiloh housed the tabernacle, the sacred sanctuary associated with Israel's worship since the wilderness period. In many ways, Shiloh represented continuity with the nation's past. Pilgrims traveled there to offer sacrifices, fulfill vows, and participate in religious observances. It served as a visible reminder that despite political divisions, Israel still possessed a shared spiritual heritage. Yet even within this sacred setting, signs of deeper problems were beginning to emerge. Leadership institutions that should have provided guidance were showing evidence of weakness. The generation responsible for preserving the nation's spiritual life faced challenges that would soon become impossible to ignore. The tension between sacred tradition and growing dysfunction forms the backdrop for everything that follows in Samuel's story. One of the most fascinating aspects of history is that major transformations often begin before people recognize their need for them. While Israel struggled with instability, no one could yet see the solution. There was no indication that a future prophet would soon emerge. There was no sign that the nation would eventually move toward monarchy. There was no reason to suspect that one of the most influential figures in biblical history was about to enter the story. Yet, beneath the surface of political uncertainty, social fragmentation, and spiritual confusion, circumstances were quietly aligning for a turning point. The nation needed leadership, but not merely the kind that could win battles or organize governments. Israel needed someone capable of addressing the deeper issues shaping its future. Before kings would rise and dynasties would be established, another story had to begin, and remarkably, that story would not start in a palace, on a battlefield, or among the powerful. It would begin with a family carrying a private burden, a burden that seemed insignificant compared to the problems facing an entire nation, yet would ultimately become the starting point for one of the most important chapters in Israel's history. While Israel wrestled with problems that threatened the stability of an entire nation, a very different struggle was unfolding within a single household. The contrast is striking. The previous chapter explored tribal fragmentation, political uncertainty, and spiritual confusion on a national scale. Now, the story narrows dramatically, focusing not on armies, leaders, or public institutions, but on one woman whose private suffering would eventually influence the course of Israel's future. This shift is one of the most remarkable features of the biblical narrative. Again and again, Scripture presents major historical turning points emerging from deeply personal circumstances. Before Samuel became a figure known throughout Israel, before kings would seek prophetic guidance, and before national reforms would take shape, his story began within a family carrying years of disappointment, unanswered questions, and emotional pain. The central figure of this chapter is Hannah, one of the wives of a man named Elkanah. According to the biblical account, Elkanah lived in the hill country of Ephraim and regularly traveled with his family to Shiloh in order to worship and offer sacrifices. On the surface, the family appeared stable and faithful. Yet, beneath that appearance, existed a source of ongoing tension. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. While Peninnah had children, Hannah remained unable to conceive. Modern readers may sympathize with Hannah's disappointment, but to understand the full weight of her situation, it is important to appreciate the social realities of the ancient Near East. In the world of ancient Israel, children represented far more than personal fulfillment. They contributed to family labor, strengthened economic security, preserved inheritance lines, and ensured the continuation of a household into future generations. Childlessness often carried emotional, social, and even economic consequences. Although the biblical text never suggests that infertility was a punishment from God, many women living in that cultural environment experienced profound shame because of it. Hannah's pain was intensified by the dynamics within her own family. Peninnah repeatedly provoked and humiliated her. The biblical narrative portrays this not as an isolated conflict, but as a recurring pattern that continued year after year. During the family's pilgrimages to Shiloh, what should have been occasions of worship and celebration became reminders of Hannah's suffering. Every feast, every sacrifice, and every family gathering reinforced the reality she could not escape. The text emphasizes that she wept and refused to eat. These details reveal the depth of her emotional burden. This was not a temporary frustration. It was a long struggle that shaped her daily life. Elkanah genuinely loved Hannah and attempted to comfort her. He even questioned why she was so troubled when his affection for her should matter more than having many sons. His words were sincere, but they also reveal an important truth about human suffering. Even the love of supportive people cannot always remove certain forms of grief. Some wounds reach places that encouragement alone cannot heal. Hannah's story resonates precisely because it acknowledges the complexity of pain without offering simplistic solutions. The turning point came during one of the family's visits to Shiloh, after a sacrificial meal. Hannah left and entered the area of the sanctuary. There she began to pray with an intensity rarely described in biblical narratives. The text says she was deeply distressed and poured out her soul before the Lord. Rather than offering a formal prayer, she brought her raw emotions into the presence of God. This aspect of the story has attracted significant attention from biblical scholars because it represents one of the clearest examples of personal lament in the Old Testament. Hannah does not hide her anguish. She does not pretend that everything is fine. She speaks honestly from the depths of her suffering. During her prayer, Hannah made a vow. If God granted her a son, she would dedicate him completely to divine service. The significance of this promise is often underestimated. Hannah was not merely asking for a child to satisfy her personal longing. She was pledging to surrender that child back to God. In practical terms, she was promising to give up the very blessing she desired most. This transforms the nature of her prayer. It was not simply a request. It was an act of trust. At that moment, Eli the priest observed her from a distance. Because Hannah prayed silently while her lips moved, Eli mistakenly assumed she was intoxicated. The misunderstanding adds a realistic human element to the story. Great moments in biblical history do not always occur under ideal circumstances. Sometimes they unfold amid confusion, misunderstanding, and ordinary human limitations. When Hannah explained her situation, Eli realized his mistake and offered a blessing, expressing hope that God would grant her request. What happened next is subtle but important. The biblical text does not immediately describe a miracle. Instead, it notes a change within Hannah herself. She left, ate, and was no longer downcast. Her circumstances had not yet changed, but her perspective had. The narrative suggests that something significant occurred before any visible answer arrived. In many biblical stories, transformation begins internally before it becomes visible externally. Eventually, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel. Scholars debate the precise etymology of the name, but the biblical narrative connects it directly to Hannah's testimony that she had asked for him from the Lord. Every mention of Samuel's name would therefore carry the memory of prayer, dependence, and divine response. Yet the most extraordinary part of the story still lay ahead. After Samuel was weaned, Hannah fulfilled the vow she had made years earlier. She brought the child to Shiloh and presented him before Eli. This decision is easy to overlook because readers already know Samuel's future importance. Yet, from Hannah's perspective, the moment involved tremendous sacrifice. The son she had longed for, prayed for, and cherished was now being dedicated to a life of service at the sanctuary. Hannah's actions demonstrate a level of commitment that transforms her from a supporting character into one of the most remarkable individuals in Samuel's story. She not only trusted God enough to ask, she trusted God enough to release what she had received. Historically speaking, neither Hannah nor anyone else could fully understand what Samuel would become. There was no indication that this child would eventually guide the nation through one of the most significant transitions in its history. Yet, the narrative intentionally highlights a recurring biblical theme. Major historical developments often begin through seemingly ordinary people, whose names rarely appear in political records or military chronicles. While leaders debated national problems and tribes struggled with uncertainty, the foundations of the future were quietly being laid in the life of a child dedicated at Shiloh. Israel did not yet know it, but the answer to challenges far larger than Hannah's personal sorrow had already been born. The story of Samuel now moves from the private world of Hannah's family into the heart of Israel's religious life. After fulfilling her vow, Hannah left her son at Shiloh, the nation's most important sanctuary. For Samuel, this meant growing up in a place unlike any other in Israel. While most children learned about worship through occasional visits to sacred sites, Samuel spent his childhood surrounded by priests, sacrifices, pilgrims, and religious rituals. Every day he witnessed the ceremonies that connected Israel to its covenant traditions. Yet one of the great ironies of this period is that the spiritual center of the nation was itself suffering from serious internal decay. The sanctuary remained active, the sacrifices continued, and the religious calendar was still observed. But beneath the surface, the leadership responsible for guiding the people was increasingly compromised. As Samuel matured, he would be shaped by a world where sacred institutions still existed, yet many of the individuals serving within them had lost sight of their true purpose. To understand the significance of Samuel's upbringing, it is necessary to understand the role of Shiloh itself. Long before Jerusalem became the center of Israelite worship, Shiloh functioned as the primary religious hub of the nation. The tabernacle, originally associated with Israel's wilderness journey after the Exodus, was located there. Pilgrims from various tribes traveled to Shiloh to offer sacrifices, fulfill vows, and participate in major religious festivals. In many respects, Shiloh represented continuity with Israel's sacred history. It reminded the people of the covenant established through Moses and preserved traditions that stretched back generations. Archaeological investigations in the region have generated considerable scholarly interest because of Shiloh's importance within the biblical narrative, although many details about the exact structure and appearance of the sanctuary remain debated. What is clear from the text, however, is that Shiloh occupied a position of enormous national significance. At the center of this religious system stood Eli, the aging priest who supervised activities at the sanctuary. Unlike some figures later condemned in the biblical narrative, Eli appears to have possessed genuine concern for Israel's spiritual welfare. Yet he also embodied one of the recurring challenges found throughout history: the difficulty of maintaining strong leadership during periods of institutional decline. Eli's greatest weakness did not involve personal corruption, but his inability to effectively address corruption within his own household. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, served as priests, yet their behavior directly contradicted the responsibilities associated with their office. According to the biblical account, they abused sacrificial practices, exploited worshippers, and treated sacred duties as opportunities for personal gain. Their actions represented more than individual moral failures. They reflected a broader problem affecting the nation's spiritual leadership. Religious authority had become disconnected from religious integrity. The contrast between official position and actual character could hardly have been more severe. The biblical author emphasizes this contrast repeatedly because it serves as the central theme of Samuel's childhood environment. On one side stood Hophni and Phinehas, men who possessed status but lacked reverence. On the other side stood a young boy with no authority, no public influence, and no recognized leadership role. Yet, while the priests abused their privileges, Samuel quietly carried out his responsibilities. The narrative repeatedly notes that Samuel ministered before the Lord. This recurring description is significant because it highlights consistency rather than dramatic achievement. At this stage, Samuel was not performing miracles, delivering prophecies, or leading the nation. He was simply serving faithfully in ordinary tasks. The emphasis on daily faithfulness distinguishes Samuel's early development from many heroic narratives. Greatness in his story does not emerge through sudden acts of power, but through years of steady formation. Another fascinating feature of this chapter is the way it explores the relationship between institutions and individuals. Modern readers often assume that healthy institutions automatically produce healthy leaders. The story of Shiloh challenges that assumption. The sanctuary itself remained a legitimate center of worship, yet some of its most prominent leaders were deeply compromised. At the same time, Samuel's example demonstrates that individuals can develop integrity even within flawed systems. He was surrounded by corruption without becoming corrupt himself. This reality adds complexity and realism to the narrative. Human character is shaped by environment, but it is not completely determined by it. Throughout history, some of the most influential reformers have emerged from institutions they would later help transform. Samuel's childhood reflects that pattern. The chapter also offers a glimpse into Hannah's continuing role in her son's life. Each year, she traveled to Shiloh and brought him a small robe she had made with her own hands. The detail occupies only a few lines in the biblical text, yet it carries tremendous emotional power. The image of a mother carefully preparing a garment for a growing child reminds readers that Samuel's story remains deeply human. Behind the future prophet stood years of quiet sacrifice, family devotion, and enduring commitment. Hannah had fulfilled her vow, but she had not disappeared from Samuel's life. Her faithfulness continued long after the dramatic prayer that introduced the story. As the years passed, Samuel gained favor among both God and the people. This brief statement is easy to overlook, but it signals an important development. Respect is beginning to accumulate around his character. Unlike influence acquired through power or position, this reputation emerges gradually through observable conduct. People notice reliability. They notice humility. They notice integrity. Samuel was becoming known not because he sought attention, but because his life increasingly stood in contrast to the failures surrounding him. Meanwhile, conditions within Eli's household continued to deteriorate. Eventually, a prophetic messenger arrived with a severe warning. Judgment would come upon Eli's family because corruption had been tolerated and sacred responsibilities had been dishonored. This announcement introduced a theme that would echo throughout the books of Samuel. Leadership carries accountability. Positions of authority do not exempt individuals from judgment. In many cases, they increase responsibility. The warning against Eli's house signaled that significant changes were approaching, even if those changes had not yet become visible. By the end of Samuel's childhood, two very different trajectories had become apparent. The established leadership of Shiloh was moving toward crisis, while a young servant was quietly developing the qualities that would soon be needed on a national scale. Neither Samuel nor the people around him fully understood what was coming. To most observers, he was simply a boy growing up within the sanctuary. Yet, history often turns on developments that attract little attention at the time. While Israel focused on its immediate concerns, the foundations of future leadership were being formed in silence. The old order was beginning to weaken, and the moment was rapidly approaching when Samuel would receive the experience that transformed him from a faithful servant within the sanctuary into one of the most important voices in the history of Israel. By the end of Samuel's childhood, two stories were moving in opposite directions. The religious establishment centered at Shiloh was losing credibility as corruption spread within its leadership, while the young servant growing up inside that same institution was quietly gaining maturity and respect. The contrast had been building for years, but a decisive moment was approaching. Up to this point, Samuel had been known primarily as a faithful assistant serving under Eli. He participated in the routines of sanctuary life, observed the rhythms of worship, and learned the responsibilities associated with sacred service. Yet he had not yet become the figure history would remember. The next stage of his life would begin during a single night, not through public recognition or political appointment, but through an experience that fundamentally altered his relationship to the nation he served. The event would mark the emergence of a new prophetic voice at a time when Israel desperately needed moral and spiritual direction. The biblical narrative introduces the episode with a statement that carries enormous historical significance. It explains that during those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and visions were uncommon. This observation serves as more than background information. It describes the broader spiritual climate of the period. Ancient Israel possessed priests, sanctuaries, sacrifices, and religious traditions, yet direct prophetic guidance appears to have become increasingly scarce. Scholars often note that the phrase reflects a period in which authoritative revelation was not widely recognized within the nation. Whether understood theologically or historically, the point remains the same. Israel was facing a leadership vacuum that extended beyond politics and institutions. The nation lacked clear direction. Against that backdrop, the experience of a young servant at Shiloh would take on extraordinary significance. The scene itself unfolds with remarkable simplicity. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, was resting within the sanctuary complex. Samuel was also lying down nearby. The narrative mentions that the lamp of God had not yet gone out, a detail that has generated considerable discussion among biblical commentators. On a practical level, the reference helps establish the time of night. Symbolically, however, many interpreters have viewed it as an image of continuity during a period of decline. Even as the existing leadership structure weakened, the possibility of renewal had not disappeared. The future remained uncertain, but it had not been extinguished. Then the unexpected occurred. Samuel heard his name being called. Assuming Eli required assistance, He immediately ran to the older priest and asked what he needed. Eli replied that he had not called and instructed the boy to return to bed. A short time later, the voice came again. Once more, Samuel hurried to Eli. Once more, Eli denied calling him. The pattern repeated a third time. On the surface, the exchange appears almost humorous, yet it reveals something important about Samuel's character. His first instinct was service. Each time he believed someone needed him, he responded without hesitation, long before he understood what was happening. He demonstrated the attentiveness and reliability that had already become part of his identity. The narrative then provides a crucial explanation. Samuel did not yet recognize the source of the voice because he had not previously experienced direct prophetic revelation. This detail is often misunderstood. It does not suggest spiritual ignorance or lack of faith. Samuel had spent years within the sanctuary and was deeply familiar with Israel's religious traditions. Rather, it indicates that he had not yet entered the role for which he was being prepared. He understood service. He understood worship. What he had not yet encountered was the personal experience of receiving a prophetic commission. Eventually, Eli recognized what was taking place. Despite the failures associated with his household, he retained enough spiritual awareness to understand that God might be speaking. He instructed Samuel that if the voice returned, he should answer by expressing his willingness to listen. The guidance is significant because it shifts the story from confusion to recognition. For the first time, Samuel becomes aware that something larger than ordinary experience is unfolding. When the voice came again, Samuel responded accordingly. What followed was not the encouraging message many readers might expect. Instead, the first revelation entrusted to Samuel concerned judgment against Eli's household. The corruption previously tolerated within the sanctuary would have consequences. The decline described in the previous chapter would not continue indefinitely. Accountability was coming. This aspect of the story is particularly striking because it immediately places Samuel in a difficult position. His first prophetic responsibility involved delivering painful news to the very man who had raised and mentored him. Leadership often requires confronting uncomfortable truths, and Samuel's introduction to prophetic ministry was no exception. The following morning, he hesitated to share what he had heard. His reluctance feels entirely human, yet Eli insisted on knowing the message. When Samuel finally revealed everything, Eli accepted the judgment with remarkable resignation. The exchange marks a symbolic transfer of authority within the narrative. The older generation remains present, but the future is beginning to move in a different direction. The significance of this chapter extends far beyond the personal experience of Samuel. Historically, it signals the reemergence of prophetic leadership within Israel. Throughout the remainder of the books of Samuel, prophets will play an increasingly important role in shaping national events. They will challenge kings, interpret crises, and provide perspectives unavailable through political calculation alone. Samuel stands at the beginning of that development. While earlier figures such as Moses and Deborah had certainly exercised prophetic functions, Samuel's ministry would help establish a model of prophetic influence that profoundly shaped Israel's future. Some scholars even describe his era as a turning point in the institutional development of prophetic leadership within the nation. As Samuel matured, reports of his reliability spread throughout Israel. The biblical text states that none of his words fell to the ground, an expression indicating that his messages consistently proved trustworthy. Over time, communities across the country came to recognize him as an authoritative prophetic figure. Importantly, this reputation was not built through military victories, inherited status, or political ambition. It emerged because people observed a pattern of credibility. In a period characterized by uncertainty and failing leadership, trust became one of the most valuable forms of influence. Samuel earned that trust gradually. The chapter therefore serves a unique purpose within the larger story. It is not primarily about personal spirituality, nor is it merely a dramatic calling narrative. It explains how a young servant became a public voice whose influence would eventually extend across the nation. More importantly, it establishes a new source of authority within Israel. The future would not be shaped solely by priests, judges, or military leaders. A prophet had emerged, and his presence would alter the course of events for decades to come, while the people of Israel remained largely unaware of what had happened during that quiet night at Shiloh. The balance of leadership was already beginning to change. The warnings against Eli's house were moving toward fulfillment. The old structures were becoming increasingly fragile, and Samuel was stepping into a role that would soon place him at the center of one of the most dramatic crises the nation had ever faced. Samuel's emergence as a prophetic figure did not immediately solve Israel's deeper problems. The nation still faced external threats, internal weaknesses, and a leadership structure already moving toward collapse. The warning delivered against Eli's household in the previous chapter remained unresolved, hanging over Shiloh like a storm waiting to break. Meanwhile, tensions with the Philistines continued to escalate. By this point in history, the Philistines had become one of the most powerful forces in the southern Levant. Archaeological evidence from coastal cities such as Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza reveals a sophisticated culture with strong military capabilities, extensive trade networks, and growing political influence. Unlike the loosely organized tribal structure of Israel, the Philistines possessed greater regional coordination and access to advanced metalworking technologies that provided important military advantages. As conflict intensified between the two peoples, Israel faced a challenge that exposed not only its military vulnerabilities, but also its misunderstandings about the nature of its relationship with God. The crisis began when Israel suffered a serious defeat during a battle against Philistine forces. Thousands of soldiers were killed, and confusion spread throughout the Israelite camp. Faced with this unexpected setback, the leaders of Israel gathered to discuss what had gone wrong. Their question appeared reasonable. Why had they lost? Yet the answer they pursued revealed a deeper problem. Rather than examining the nation's spiritual condition, leadership failures, or covenant responsibilities, they focused on a symbolic solution. They decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield. The Ark occupied a unique place in Israel's history. It represented God's covenant presence among his people, and had been associated with significant moments dating back to the wilderness period and the conquest under Joshua. For generations, it served as one of the most sacred objects in Israelite worship. The decision to bring it into battle therefore generated enormous excitement among the troops. When the Ark arrived, the soldiers shouted so loudly that the sound echoed across the battlefield. Confidence surged. Many believed victory was now inevitable. Ironically, the reaction of the Philistines reveals how powerful Israel's religious reputation had become. Upon hearing about the Ark, they grew alarmed and recalled stories connected to Israel's God. Yet, rather than retreating, they prepared themselves for a desperate fight. What followed shocked everyone involved. The battle ended in catastrophe. Israel suffered an even greater defeat than before. Thousands more were killed. Hophni and Phinehas died exactly as had been foretold. Most devastating of all, the Ark of the Covenant was captured. From a military perspective, the loss was severe. From a religious perspective, it seemed almost unthinkable. The event shattered assumptions many Israelites had apparently developed about divine protection. The narrative carefully exposes a dangerous misunderstanding. The people had treated the Ark as though its presence alone guaranteed victory. In effect, they attempted to turn a sacred symbol into a strategic weapon. Yet the covenant relationship represented by the ark could not be reduced to a ritual object. Possessing the symbol did not automatically ensure divine favor. This lesson stands at the heart of the entire episode. Religious symbols carry meaning, but they are not substitutes for faithfulness. The crisis therefore becomes more than a military defeat. It becomes a theological reckoning. News of the disaster quickly reached Shiloh. Eli, now 98 years old and blind, sat waiting anxiously beside the road. Significantly, the biblical text emphasizes that his concern centered on the ark. When a messenger finally arrived, he delivered the devastating report piece by piece. Israel had fled. Thousands had died. Hophni and Phinehas were dead. Then came the final announcement. The ark of God had been captured. Upon hearing those words, Eli fell backward from his seat, broke his neck, and died. His death marked the fulfillment of the judgment previously announced against his household. More importantly, it symbolized the collapse of an entire era of leadership. The sanctuary still stood, but the system that had governed it was disintegrating. Yet the story does not end with the death of Eli. In many ways, the most remarkable part of the ark narrative occurs after its capture. The Philistines carried the ark into the temple of Dagon at Ashdod, intending to display it as a trophy of victory. From their perspective, the triumph of their army demonstrated the superiority of their God over Israel's God. However, the biblical narrative immediately challenges that interpretation. The next morning, the statue of Dagon was found fallen before the ark. The priests restored it to its place, but on the following day the image had fallen again, this time shattered. Soon afterward, severe afflictions spread among the population. Fear and panic followed as city after city experienced similar disturbances whenever the ark arrived. Whether understood through theological interpretation or literary symbolism, the message is unmistakable. The God represented by the ark had not been defeated. Israel's loss did not indicate divine weakness. The crisis exposed Israel's failures, but it did not diminish God's sovereignty. After months of turmoil, the Philistines concluded that keeping the ark was too dangerous. They returned it to Israel, along with offerings intended to acknowledge the calamities they had experienced. This portion of the narrative is often overlooked in modern retellings, yet it serves an essential purpose. It prevents readers from interpreting the battle as a simple victory of one deity over another. Instead, the story demonstrates that God's purposes continued even in the midst of national humiliation. Israel had lost the battle, but the larger theological narrative remained intact. The return of the ark also created an important transition point. The old leadership centered around Eli's house was gone. Shiloh's prestige had been deeply shaken. The nation had been forced to confront painful truths about misplaced confidence, institutional corruption, and superficial religion. Yet, crises often clear away structures that can no longer sustain the future. The collapse described in this chapter was not merely an ending. It created the conditions for something new to emerge. Samuel, who had received his prophetic commission before these events unfolded, now stood in a dramatically altered landscape. The warnings he delivered had proven true. The old order had fallen. Israel remained wounded and uncertain, but the stage was finally being set for a different kind of leadership. Before the nation could move toward restoration, it first had to pass through the ruins of what it had become. Only then could a new chapter begin. The collapse of Eli's household and the humiliation surrounding the ark crisis left Israel in a profoundly weakened condition. The nation had suffered military defeat, religious embarrassment, and a loss of confidence in the institutions that had once provided stability. The sanctuary at Shiloh no longer occupied the same position it once held. The old leadership structure had disintegrated, and the people were forced to confront difficult questions about their future. Yet history often reveals a pattern in which moments of collapse become opportunities for renewal. The generation that experienced the Ark crisis learned a painful lesson. Symbols alone could not sustain a covenant relationship. Sacred traditions could not compensate for spiritual compromise. Military victories could not be manufactured through ritual. Before Israel could move forward, it needed more than new strategies or stronger defenses. It needed a re-examination of its identity. It was within this environment that Samuel gradually emerged as the central figure capable of guiding the nation through a period of reconstruction. Unlike the dramatic events that characterized the previous chapter, this transformation unfolded over time. The biblical narrative indicates that many years passed after the return of the Ark. During this period, Samuel's influence continued to expand throughout Israel. He was no longer simply the young servant from Shiloh or the recipient of a prophetic calling. He had become a respected national figure whose credibility rested on demonstrated reliability. The warnings associated with Eli's household had proven accurate. The crisis surrounding the Ark had unfolded exactly as predicted. As a result, people increasingly viewed Samuel as a trustworthy source of guidance during uncertain times. This growing reputation proved essential, because the challenge facing Israel was larger than a single battle or political dispute. The nation required a process of long-term recovery. Samuel recognized that Israel's greatest weakness was not primarily military. The Philistines remained a threat, but foreign pressure was only one symptom of a deeper issue. The recurring problem throughout the period of the Judges had been divided loyalty. Generations of Israelites had attempted to balance covenant worship with the religious practices of surrounding cultures. Archaeological discoveries across the ancient Levant have repeatedly demonstrated how interconnected these societies were. Trade, mass migration, and cultural exchange created constant opportunities for religious influence. Within such an environment, maintaining a distinct national and spiritual identity required deliberate commitment. Samuel understood that no lasting restoration could occur without addressing this foundational issue. His response was remarkably direct. He challenged the people to remove the foreign gods that remained among them and recommit themselves to the covenant. This appeal differed from many ancient political reforms because it focused on allegiance rather than administration. Samuel was not proposing a new government structure. He was calling for a renewed sense of collective purpose. The challenge demanded action, not merely agreement. According to the biblical account, the people responded positively. They removed symbols associated with foreign worship and gathered at Mizpah, a location that would soon become one of the most significant sites in Samuel's ministry. The assembly at Mizpah represents one of the most important national gatherings in the books of Samuel. Unlike military musters organized for warfare, this gathering centered on reflection, confession, and public acknowledgement of failure. The people fasted and openly admitted that they had sinned against the Lord. From a historical perspective, collective acts of repentance played an important role in many ancient societies because they reinforced communal identity and social cohesion. In Israel's case, the event carried additional covenant significance. The nation was not merely expressing regret, it was reaffirming the principles that defined its existence. Samuel's role during the assembly highlights an important aspect of his leadership. He functioned less as a ruler, imposing solutions, and more as a mediator, helping the people rediscover their foundational commitments. The gathering, however, soon attracted attention from outside forces. When the Philistines learned that large numbers of Israelites had assembled at Mizpah, they interpreted the event as a potential threat. concerned about the possibility of rebellion or military mobilization. They advanced toward the region. News of the approaching army created immediate anxiety among the Israelites. The memory of previous defeats remained fresh. Many remembered the disaster associated with the ark and understood the military superiority the Philistines often enjoyed. Yet, the response this time differed significantly from earlier crises. During the ark episode, Israel had attempted to secure victory through a sacred object. At Mizpah, the people turned to Samuel and asked him to intercede on their behalf. The distinction is subtle but important. Confidence was no longer being placed in an object, ritual, or symbol. Instead, the focus shifted toward dependence upon God and the renewal of covenant commitment. Samuel offered a sacrifice and prayed for the nation as the threat drew near. The biblical narrative then describes a dramatic intervention. As the Philistines advanced, a powerful thunderstorm or divine disturbance threw their forces into confusion, allowing Israel to launch a successful counterattack. Historians and theologians have long debated the precise nature of the event. Some emphasize supernatural intervention. Others note how sudden weather phenomena have occasionally influenced battles throughout history. Regardless of interpretation, the narrative's purpose remains clear. The victory is presented as the result of divine assistance rather than military superiority alone. For the first time in many years, Israel experienced a significant reversal of fortune. The consequences extended beyond a single battle. Philistine dominance was reduced. Territories were recovered, and a period of greater stability followed. Yet, perhaps the most enduring result emerged after the conflict ended. Samuel erected a stone between Mizpah and Shen and named it Ebenezer, meaning stone of help. Memorial stones occupied an important place within ancient Israelite tradition. They served as physical reminders of events future generations might otherwise forget. By establishing Ebenezer, Samuel ensured that the lessons of the moment would not be lost. The monument was not intended to celebrate military achievement. It commemorated a process. Israel had moved from humiliation to restoration, from fragmentation toward renewed unity, and from misplaced confidence toward a clear understanding of its covenant identity. The significance of Mizpah therefore extends far beyond the battlefield. It represents the first major success of Samuel's public leadership and demonstrates the distinctive approach that would define much of his career. He did not begin by building armies, creating political institutions, or pursuing territorial expansion. He began by addressing questions of identity, loyalty, and collective purpose. In doing so, he helped stabilize a nation emerging from one of the most turbulent periods in its history. Yet, the success achieved at Mizpah would soon create a new challenge. As stability returned and Samuel's influence expanded, Israel began to ask a different kind of question. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but uncertainty about the nation's long-term future remained. The answer to that question would eventually lead Israel toward one of the most significant political transformations in its history, a transformation that would place Samuel once again at the center of events. The victory at Mizpah accomplished far more than the defeat of a Philistine army. It marked the beginning of a period in which Israel experienced an unusual degree of stability after generations of recurring crisis. For much of the era described in the Book of Judges, national life had been reactive. Leaders emerged when emergencies erupted, rallied local tribes, addressed immediate threats, and then disappeared from the narrative. The system was capable of producing remarkable individuals during moments of danger, but it struggled to provide consistent leadership across multiple generations. What followed Mizpah was different. Instead of responding to a single crisis, Samuel gradually helped establish a framework that brought continuity, accountability, and cohesion to a nation that had long been fragmented. This chapter is not primarily about a dramatic event. It is about a process. It is about how one leader helped transform a loose collection of tribes into a more organized society, capable of navigating an increasingly complex world. One reason Samuel occupies such a unique place in biblical history is that his influence extended beyond any single role. Modern readers often categorize historical figures into clear professional identities: political leader, military commander, religious authority, or legal administrator. Samuel does not fit comfortably into any one category. His responsibilities overlapped multiple areas of national life. This made him particularly effective during a period when Israel lacked strong, centralized institutions. Rather than concentrating power within a single location, Samuel developed a style of leadership that connected different regions and communities. The biblical text describes him traveling regularly between Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and Ramah. These journeys were not ceremonial visits. They formed the basis of an administrative network through which disputes were settled. Decisions were made, and relationships between tribal communities were maintained. In practical terms, Samuel functioned as a stabilizing force within a decentralized society. The importance of this system is often overlooked because it lacks the dramatic appeal of battles and royal ceremonies. Yet, from a historical perspective, effective administration frequently shapes the future more profoundly than isolated military victories. Ancient societies depended heavily on trusted local leadership. Without reliable mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining cooperation, internal divisions could quickly become destructive. Samuel's circuit of leadership helped reduce that risk. His presence created a sense of continuity across tribal boundaries and encouraged a broader understanding of national identity. In many ways, he provided Israel with some of the benefits associated with centralized governance long before the monarchy officially existed. Equally significant was Samuel's role in preserving accountability. Throughout the ancient Near East, political power often operated with minimal restraint. Kings, military commanders, and local rulers frequently exercised authority according to personal interests. Israel's covenant tradition introduced a different ideal. Leaders were expected to operate within a moral framework that transcended their own ambitions. Samuel became one of the strongest defenders of that principle. His authority did not depend upon military strength or hereditary status. Instead, it rested on public trust and perceived integrity. This distinction would later prove crucial when kings entered the story. Samuel's career helped establish the expectation that political authority should remain answerable to higher standards rather than functioning without limits. Another aspect of Samuel's influence appears in the development of prophetic leadership. Earlier figures such as Moses, Miriam, Deborah, and others had certainly exercised prophetic roles, but Samuel's generation appears to mark an important stage in the institutional growth of prophetic activity within Israel. Several passages later in the books of Samuel refer to groups or communities associated with prophetic practice. While scholars continue to debate the precise nature of these groups, many believe Samuel played a significant role in encouraging environments where prophetic traditions could be preserved and developed. If this interpretation is correct, Samuel's impact extended far beyond his own lifetime. The prophetic voices that later challenged kings, confronted injustice, and shaped Israel's spiritual history may owe part of their development to foundations established during his era. The significance of this possibility cannot be overstated. Some leaders influence events directly. Others create systems that continue influencing events long after they are gone. Samuel appears to have done both. The years following Mizpah also reveal an important characteristic of his leadership. Unlike many figures in ancient history, Samuel showed little interest in building a personal dynasty. This point becomes especially striking when compared with neighboring cultures. Throughout the ancient world, Successful leaders often sought to secure power through family succession. Dynasties were viewed as symbols of legitimacy and stability. Yet, Samuel's focus remained on strengthening the nation rather than establishing his own house. Ironically, the shortcomings of his sons would later contribute to one of the most important political debates in Israel's history. But Samuel himself never appears motivated by personal ambition. His priorities consistently centered on national welfare rather than family advancement. This distinction helps explain why his reputation remained so strong across different tribal communities. During these years, Israel also experienced relative relief from Philistine domination. The reduction of external pressure allowed communities to rebuild, agricultural production to recover, and regional relationships to stabilize. Peace does not generate the same narrative excitement as warfare, but it often creates the conditions necessary for long-term development. Many of the changes associated with Samuel's leadership would have been impossible during periods of constant conflict. Stability provided space for institutions to mature and for broader questions about Israel's future to emerge. Those questions gradually became impossible to ignore as surrounding nations expanded their political structures and consolidated power under kings. Many Israelites began comparing their situation with that of their neighbors. The old tribal system had survived numerous challenges, but new realities were emerging. Military threats were becoming more sophisticated. Regional politics were becoming more competitive. The question facing Israel was no longer simply how to survive the next crisis. It was how to position itself for the future. Samuel's leadership had successfully guided the nation through recovery and stabilization, but his achievements also highlighted an uncomfortable reality. Much of the system depended upon his personal credibility. What would happen when he was no longer able to lead? This concern became increasingly important as Samuel grew older. For decades he had served as mediator, judge, administrator, and national guide. Few individuals possessed comparable authority or trust. The challenge of succession began to loom over the nation. The issue was not whether Samuel had been successful. Few leaders in Israel's history had accomplished more. The issue was whether the structure he helped sustain could survive beyond his lifetime. This question would eventually trigger one of the most consequential decisions in Israel's history. The nation Samuel helped restore was now stable enough to think about its future, but the answer many Israelites proposed would fundamentally alter the course of that future. The era shaped by judges and prophetic leadership was approaching a turning point, and the debate that followed would place Samuel at the center of a political transformation, unlike anything Israel had experienced before. The stability Samuel helped create eventually produced a new and unexpected challenge. For generations, Israel's greatest concern had been survival. Tribal conflicts, foreign invasions, religious instability, and leadership crises dominated national life. Under Samuel's guidance, many of those immediate problems had been reduced. The Philistine threat was less severe than before. Internal cohesion had improved. Public confidence in leadership had largely been restored. Yet history often shows that success creates its own questions. Once a society moves beyond crisis management, it begins to think about long-term structure, succession, and future security. These were precisely the issues confronting Israel as Samuel entered the later years of his life. The nation had recovered enough to ask not how it would survive the present, but how it would prepare for the future. The answer many Israelites proposed would fundamentally alter the course of their history. The issue emerged through a practical concern rather than an ideological movement. Samuel was aging. For decades, much of Israel's stability had depended upon his leadership, reputation, and judgment. As long as he remained active, the system functioned reasonably well. The problem was what would happen after him, According to the biblical narrative, Samuel appointed his sons, Joel and Abijah, to positions of judicial responsibility. On paper, the decision may have seemed logical. Succession often begins with familiar and trusted individuals. Yet, the outcome quickly became troubling. Unlike their father, Samuel's sons developed a reputation for accepting bribes and distorting justice. The contrast is striking because it echoes an earlier pattern in the story. Years before, Eli's household had suffered from leadership failures involving the next generation. Now, a similar concern appeared within Samuel's own family. The Bible does not portray Samuel as corrupt, nor does it suggest that he approved of their behavior. Nevertheless, the situation created legitimate anxiety among Israel's elders. They respected Samuel, but they had little confidence in the prospect of leadership passing to his sons. In response, representatives from across the nation gathered and approached Samuel with a proposal. Their request was simple, direct, and revolutionary. They wanted a king. At first glance, the demand appears entirely reasonable. In fact, many historians argue that the emergence of monarchy was a natural development given the political realities of the ancient Near East. Throughout the region, kingdoms with centralized governments increasingly dominated the geopolitical landscape. Powerful states maintained standing armies, organized taxation systems, permanent administrative structures, and stronger national identities. Compared to these monarchies, Israel's tribal federation often appeared fragmented and vulnerable. From a strategic perspective, many Israelites likely believed that a king would provide continuity, military efficiency, and political stability. Their request, therefore, reflected genuine concerns rather than mere rebellion. Yet beneath those practical motivations lay a deeper issue that Samuel immediately recognized. The elders did not simply ask for a king. They explained that they wanted a king, so they could be like the other nations. This statement became the focal point of the entire controversy. Throughout its history, Israel's identity had been rooted in the belief that it occupied a unique place among the peoples of the ancient world. The covenant tradition established through Moses emphasized a different understanding of leadership, authority, and national purpose. While neighboring societies organized themselves around royal dynasties, Israel's foundational narrative centered on divine kingship. Human leaders existed, but they functioned within a framework that acknowledged a higher authority. Samuel understood that the request for a king involved more than governmental reform. It raised fundamental questions about identity, trust, and the direction of the nation. Unsure how to respond, Samuel brought the matter before God. This moment reveals an important aspect of his leadership style. Rather than relying solely on personal opinion or political calculation, he sought guidance before acting. The response he received was unexpected. God instructed him to listen to the people's request. However, the explanation accompanying that instruction was deeply sobering. The issue was not merely that Israel desired political change. According to the narrative, the request reflected a broader pattern stretching back generations. The people had repeatedly struggled with the temptation to place their confidence in visible structures rather than covenant faithfulness. The demand for a king, therefore, became part of a larger historical tension. It was not necessarily wrong to establish a monarchy. Earlier biblical texts had anticipated the possibility of kingship. The concern involved the motivations driving the request and the expectations attached to it. Before granting their desire, Samuel was instructed to explain the realities that accompanied monarchy. What followed is one of the most remarkable political speeches in the Old Testament. Samuel described what kings actually do. They draft young men into military service. They appoint officials and commanders. They require labor for state projects. They claim agricultural resources and impose economic obligations. In other words, centralized power brings benefits, but it also carries costs. Modern readers are often surprised by how realistic Samuel's warning sounds. Rather than discussing monarchy in idealized terms, he focuses on the practical consequences of political centralization. Historians frequently note that many of the developments Samuel described became common features of ancient kingdoms throughout the region. The speech therefore functions not only as a theological warning, but also as a sophisticated reflection on political power itself. Yet the people remained unconvinced. They acknowledged the warning and rejected it. Their response reveals the strength of their determination. They wanted a king to judge them, lead them, and fight their battles. At the heart of the request was a desire for visible leadership capable of projecting national strength. After generations of decentralized governance, many Israelites believed the future required a different model. The debate had effectively been settled. Israel would move toward monarchy. From a historical perspective, this decision marks one of the most significant turning points in the entire Old Testament. The era shaped by judges, tribal coalitions, and regional leadership was drawing to a close. A new political order was about to emerge. For Samuel, the moment carried a profound irony. Much of the nation's desire for stability existed because of the success he had achieved. His leadership had demonstrated what effective national guidance could accomplish. Yet, that same success highlighted the limitations of a system dependent upon exceptional individuals. The people were no longer asking how to find another Samuel. They were asking how to build a structure capable of surviving after Samuel was gone. The answer they chose would reshape Israel for centuries. As the elders returned home and discussions spread across the tribes, no one yet knew who would become the nation's first king. The political revolution had been approved, but its central figure remained unknown. Somewhere within the territory of Benjamin, a young man was living an ordinary life, completely unaware that the future of Israel was about to intersect with his own in the most unexpected way imaginable. Israel had made its decision. The debate was over. The elders had spoken. Samuel had delivered his warning, and the nation was moving toward monarchy. Yet one crucial question remained unanswered. Who would become Israel's first king? From a human perspective, this was now the most important issue in the country. A new political system was about to emerge, and the identity of its first ruler could shape the future for generations. Modern audiences might expect a process involving public campaigns, elite negotiations, military heroes, or influential families competing for power. Instead, the biblical narrative takes a remarkably different approach. Rather than beginning with political ambition, it begins with an ordinary problem: a few lost animals. The contrast is intentional. The previous chapter focused on national decisions and institutional change. This chapter shifts attention toward the unexpected ways history often unfolds. While Israel searched for a king, the future king was not searching for a throne. He was searching for donkeys. The story opens in the territory of Benjamin, the smallest of Israel's tribes. Benjamin occupied a strategic but often vulnerable position between larger tribal regions. Historically, the tribe carried a complicated legacy. The closing chapters of Judges describe a devastating civil conflict that nearly destroyed it generations earlier. Although Benjamin survived, it never possessed the same influence as larger tribes such as Judah or Ephraim. Against this backdrop, the narrative introduces a man named Kish, described as wealthy and influential. His son Saul immediately attracts attention. The text emphasizes his physical appearance, noting that he was unusually tall and impressive. In the ancient Near East, physical stature often carried symbolic significance. Height, strength, and visible presence were commonly associated with leadership potential. Ancient rulers frequently projected authority through appearance as much as through policy. The description, therefore, prepares readers for an important contrast. Saul already possesses many of the qualities people typically expect in a king, yet he remains completely unaware of the role he is about to play. The immediate problem confronting Saul is far more mundane. Several donkeys belonging to his father have wandered away, and he is assigned the task of finding them. Together with a servant, he begins a search across multiple regions. They travel through the hill country, move from area to area, and repeatedly fail to locate the missing animals. As the journey continues, the story unfolds almost like a travel narrative. There is no indication that anything extraordinary is happening. Saul appears practical, responsible, and concerned about his father's welfare. Eventually, he suggests abandoning the search because he fears Kish will become more worried about them than about the donkeys themselves. At this point, the servant offers a suggestion that alters the course of Israel's history. He mentions a respected man of God living nearby and proposes consulting him for guidance. This recommendation reveals something important about Samuel's reputation. By this stage of his life, Samuel's influence extended far beyond formal leadership circles. Ordinary people believed he possessed insight, capable of helping them navigate difficult situations. The servant's confidence demonstrates how widely Samuel's authority had become recognized throughout the nation. Saul agrees to seek the prophet's help, unaware that his journey is moving toward a destination arranged long before he began searching for livestock. The narrative then reveals information hidden from Saul, but known to readers. The day before the meeting, God had informed Samuel that a man from Benjamin would arrive. This individual, Samuel was told, would become the leader Israel had requested. The literary effect is highly effective. Readers now understand that two stories are converging. Samuel knows the significance of the coming encounter. Saul does not. The resulting tension drives the remainder of the chapter. Every step Saul takes toward the city carries meaning he cannot yet perceive. Historians sometimes describe such moments as examples of contingency, situations where seemingly insignificant events influence major historical outcomes. The biblical narrative frames the same phenomenon through the language of providence. Ordinary circumstances become vehicles for larger purposes. Upon approaching the city, Saul encounters young women drawing water and asks whether the seer is nearby. The title, seer, reflects an older term for prophetic figures and provides an interesting glimpse into Israel's developing religious vocabulary. The women explain that Samuel has just arrived for a sacrificial gathering and encourage Saul to hurry before the ceremony begins. Once again, timing plays a critical role. Had Saul arrived earlier or later, the encounter might have unfolded very differently. Instead, every detail appears to align with remarkable precision. The narrative encourages readers to notice how events that seem accidental often contribute to larger outcomes. When Saul finally meets Samuel, the encounter begins almost comically. Not recognizing the prophet, Saul politely asks for directions to the seer's house. Samuel responds by identifying himself and immediately shifting the conversation away from the missing animals. He assures Saul that the donkeys have already been found, and then introduces a far more surprising subject. Samuel begins speaking about Israel's future, and suggests that Saul occupies a central place within it. The response reveals much about Saul's self-perception at this stage of the story. Rather than displaying ambition or entitlement, he expresses genuine surprise. He points to his tribal background and family status as reasons he should not be considered significant. Whether this reflects humility, uncertainty, or simple disbelief remains difficult to determine. Regardless, Saul does not behave like a man expecting royal treatment. Samuel then escorts him to a special banquet and places him in a position of honor among distinguished guests. The gesture carries obvious symbolic significance. Though its full meaning remains unclear to Saul, Throughout the meal and the conversations that follow, Samuel carefully prepares him for a revelation that will soon transform his understanding of himself and his future. Yet the chapter deliberately delays that revelation. The focus remains on process rather than outcome. This narrative choice serves an important purpose. Before Saul can become king, readers are invited to see him as an ordinary individual navigating everyday responsibilities. The future monarch enters the story not through conquest, privilege, or political maneuvering, but through circumstances almost anyone could experience. The search for lost donkeys, therefore, becomes much more than a plot device. It becomes a reflection on how history often unfolds. Major transformations rarely announce themselves in advance. People frequently believe they are pursuing one objective, while unknowingly moving toward another. By the end of the chapter, Saul still thinks he is returning home after solving a family problem. He has no idea that Samuel already knows the future awaiting him. Yet, the political revolution described in the previous chapter now has a face. The nation may not know it yet, but the man who will become Israel's first king has finally entered the story. The next step belongs to Samuel, and what happens next will forever alter the course of Israel's history. The previous chapter ended with an ordinary journey suddenly colliding with national destiny. Saul had set out to find lost donkeys, and unexpectedly found himself sitting at a place of honor beside the most respected leader in Israel. Yet, despite the unusual hospitality and mysterious conversations, he still did not understand why Samuel had taken such interest in him. That uncertainty would not last much longer. Israel had demanded a king. The political transformation discussed in the previous chapter was already underway. What remained was the selection of the individual who would embody this new era. Samuel now faced one of the most consequential responsibilities of his life. For decades, he had guided Israel through crisis, reform, and recovery. Now he would oversee the birth of the monarchy itself. The events that followed would not simply determine who became king. They would establish the principles, expectations, and tensions that would shape Israel's royal history for centuries to come. The story begins with a private encounter. Before Saul could be publicly presented to the nation, Samuel arranged for a moment away from crowds, ceremonies, and political pressures. This detail is significant because it highlights an important feature of biblical leadership narratives. Public authority often begins with private commissioning. The future king first needed to understand his role before the people could recognize it. Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it over Saul's head, formally anointing him as ruler. To modern readers, the ritual may appear unfamiliar, but within the ancient Near East, anointing carried profound symbolic meaning. Oil was associated with consecration, distinction, and appointment to a special task. The ceremony indicated that Saul was being set apart for a unique responsibility. It is important to note that the act did not magically transform him into a king in the political sense. He did not immediately receive a throne, an army, or a royal palace. Instead, the anointing marked the beginning of a process through which authority would gradually be recognized and established. The ritual also introduced a concept that would become central to Israel's future. From this point forward, kingship was connected not merely to political power, but to divine appointment. Samuel did not choose Saul because of tribal pressure or personal preference. The narrative consistently presents the selection as part of a larger purpose. Yet, the story carefully avoids portraying Saul as a passive figure. He would still need to lead, decide, and act. The anointing provided a calling, not a guarantee of success. This distinction becomes increasingly important as Saul's story unfolds. Following the ceremony, Samuel gave Saul a series of specific predictions concerning events that would occur on his journey home. The purpose of these signs was practical. Saul had just received astonishing news. Understandably, he might struggle to believe it. The signs therefore served as confirmations that the encounter was not the product of imagination or coincidence. Samuel described people Saul would meet, messages he would hear, and circumstances he would encounter. As the narrative progresses, each prediction unfolds exactly as described. The cumulative effect reinforces Samuel's credibility and provides Saul with growing confidence that he has been drawn into something larger than himself. Among these experiences, one stands out above the others. Saul encountered a group associated with prophetic activity and became caught up in their worship. The biblical text describes a dramatic experience in which he joined them in prophetic expression. The event surprised those who knew him and generated a saying that circulated widely afterward. Historians and scholars have proposed various explanations for what occurred, ranging from ecstatic worship practices common in parts of the ancient Near East to uniquely theological interpretations rooted in the biblical narrative. Whatever the precise nature of the experience, its significance within the story is clear. Saul's life was changing. He was being prepared psychologically, socially, and spiritually for a role he had never expected to occupy. The narrative also emphasizes that he received what is described as a new heart. Rather than focusing on mystical transformation, the phrase likely communicates a change in orientation and readiness. Saul was no longer simply the son of Kish, searching for livestock. He was beginning the transition toward leadership. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this chapter is how long Saul remains largely unknown to the wider nation. Modern political culture often emphasizes immediate visibility. Leaders announce candidacies, build public profiles, and seek recognition. Saul's path unfolded differently. The private anointing occurred first. Public recognition came later. Samuel eventually summoned the tribes to Mizpah, the same location associated with earlier moments of national renewal. The setting was appropriate because Israel's transition to monarchy represented more than a constitutional change. It was a defining moment in the nation's identity. Before revealing the chosen king, Samuel reminded the people of their history. He recalled God's acts of deliverance and the repeated ways Israel had been preserved through previous crises. This reminder served an important purpose. The monarchy was being established, but the nation was not meant to forget the foundations upon which it existed. Political structures could change. Covenant responsibilities remained. The selection process itself unfolded through the casting of lots, a practice commonly used in the ancient world to discern decisions believed to be guided by divine oversight. Tribe after tribe was eliminated until Benjamin was chosen. Then a clan was selected. Finally, Saul's name emerged. The dramatic tension of the moment immediately increased because Saul was nowhere to be found. The future king had disappeared. After a search, he was discovered hiding among the baggage. This detail has fascinated readers for centuries because it reveals something deeply human about Saul. Historians often note that many individuals placed in positions of leadership experience uncertainty when confronted with responsibilities larger than themselves. Saul's reaction may reflect humility, insecurity, fear, or some combination of all three. Whatever the explanation, it sharply contrasts with the image of ambitious rulers commonly found in ancient history, once brought before the assembly. However, Saul's appearance immediately captured attention. Standing taller than everyone around him, he possessed the physical presence many people associated with kingship. Samuel presented him to the nation, and the crowd responded enthusiastically. The long debate described in the previous chapter had finally reached its conclusion. Israel now had a king, yet the narrative subtly introduces a note of caution amid the celebration. not everyone supported Saul. Some questioned his suitability and expressed skepticism about his ability to lead. These voices remained a minority, but their presence reminds readers that political transitions are rarely as simple as public ceremonies suggest. Even at the moment of national unity, seeds of future tension already existed beneath the surface. Samuel then documented the rights and responsibilities associated with kingship and placed them before the people. This action is often overlooked, yet it reveals one of the most important themes in the entire books of Samuel. The king would possess authority, but that authority was not absolute. Israel's monarchy was intended to function within a framework of accountability. Political leadership remained connected to moral responsibility. This principle would eventually shape many of the dramatic confrontations between kings and prophets that define Israel's later history. By the end of the chapter, the monarchy officially existed. The nation celebrated, and Saul returned home with a growing circle of supporters. Everything appeared full of promise. Yet, the story intentionally leaves an important question unanswered. The people had chosen a political system. Samuel had anointed a king, but no ceremony could determine what kind of leader Saul would ultimately become. The true test of kingship would not be public approval, physical appearance, or early popularity. It would emerge through decisions made under pressure, and those tests were approaching far sooner than anyone realized. The establishment of Israel's monarchy initially appeared successful. Saul had been publicly recognized as king. Support for his leadership was growing, and early military achievements helped strengthen confidence in the new political system. From the perspective of many Israelites, the decision to request a king seemed justified. The nation possessed a visible leader capable of organizing military responses and representing national interests. For a time, Saul embodied many of the qualities people had hoped to find in a ruler. He demonstrated courage, inspired loyalty, and achieved victories that enhanced his reputation. Yet one of the most important themes running through the books of Samuel is the distinction between success and sustainability. A leader may perform effectively during favorable circumstances while still possessing weaknesses capable of undermining everything that has been built. The true measure of leadership often emerges not during moments of triumph, but during periods of pressure. As Saul's reign progressed, a series of decisions gradually revealed deeper issues that military victories alone could not conceal. The turning point did not occur because Saul lacked talent, intelligence, or courage. Rather, it emerged through his relationship with authority itself. Throughout Israel's covenant tradition, leaders were expected to operate within established boundaries. Kings possessed significant power, but they were not intended to function as autonomous rulers accountable only to themselves. Samuel had emphasized this principle from the very beginning of the monarchy. The challenge facing Saul was whether he would continue to respect those limits once power became firmly established in his hands. The first major test arose during a period of military tension involving the Philistines. Saul found himself facing a difficult situation. Enemy forces were gathering. His own troops were becoming increasingly anxious, and uncertainty spread throughout the camp. Samuel had previously instructed him to wait for a specific period before taking further action. The command may appear simple, but its significance extended far beyond scheduling. Waiting required trust. It required restraint. Most importantly, it required recognizing that not every problem could be solved through immediate action. As the days passed and the situation became more threatening, Saul grew impatient, observing soldiers beginning to scatter and fearing the collapse of morale. He decided to proceed without Samuel. He offered a sacrifice himself and attempted to move the situation forward according to his own judgment. From a purely practical perspective, the decision might seem understandable. Military leaders frequently face pressure to act quickly during crises. The problem was not tactical. The issue involved the gradual erosion of boundaries. Saul chose to bypass an instruction because he believed circumstances justified doing so. Almost immediately after the sacrifice was completed, Samuel arrived. The timing creates one of the most dramatic scenes in Saul's story. Had he waited only a little longer, the confrontation could have been avoided. Instead, Samuel questioned his actions and forced Saul to explain himself. The king responded by describing the pressures he faced. He pointed to the approaching enemy, the anxiety among his troops, and the absence of Samuel. His explanation reveals an important pattern that would become increasingly visible throughout his reign. Saul consistently viewed problems through the lens of immediate necessity. Faced with pressure, he prioritized results. Samuel, by contrast, focused on principles. The prophet understood that leadership built entirely on expediency eventually becomes unstable, because every difficult situation can be used to justify abandoning previous commitments. The confrontation ended with a sobering warning. Samuel declared that Saul's kingdom would not endure. Significantly, this was not an announcement of immediate removal. Saul would continue ruling for years. However, the encounter revealed a trajectory. Leadership was beginning to shift away from the foundations upon which it had originally been established. Yet, the most decisive moment still lay ahead. Years later, another military campaign would expose the same pattern in a far more serious way. Through Samuel, Saul received instructions concerning the Amalekites. The campaign itself was successful. Israel achieved victory, demonstrating once again that Saul remained a capable military leader. However, the aftermath revealed a critical problem. Rather than carrying out the instructions exactly as given, Saul modified them. He spared Agag, the Amalekite king, and preserved valuable livestock. On the surface, the decision may have appeared reasonable. Victorious rulers throughout the ancient world often kept defeated kings alive for political purposes and retained valuable resources as spoils of war. From a conventional political perspective, Saul's actions made sense, yet the narrative deliberately highlights the tension between political logic and covenant responsibility. The issue was not whether Saul could provide rational explanations. The issue was whether he considered himself authorized to redefine instructions according to his own preferences. Before Samuel even arrived, another revealing detail appears in the story. Saul erected a monument in his own honor. The significance of this action should not be overlooked. Earlier chapters portrayed him as uncertain and reluctant when first chosen as king. Now he had begun commemorating his own achievements. The contrast illustrates one of history's recurring leadership challenges. Success often changes people gradually, rather than suddenly. Confidence can evolve into self-reliance. Accomplishment can evolve into self-importance. Leaders rarely recognize the shift while it is happening. Samuel's arrival transformed the celebration into a confrontation. Initially, Saul insisted that he had obeyed the command. The claim is striking because evidence to the contrary surrounded him. When Samuel pointed to the sounds of surviving livestock, Saul adjusted his explanation and shifted responsibility toward the people. The progression is revealing. Instead of fully accepting responsibility, he moved between justification and deflection. Samuel responded with one of the most famous declarations in the Old Testament. He explained that obedience is better than sacrifice, and attentiveness better than the fat of rams. The statement is frequently quoted, but its original context is crucial. Samuel was not condemning sacrifice itself. Sacrificial worship occupied an important place within Israelite religion. The problem arose when ritual was used to rationalize disobedience. Saul attempted to present preserved livestock as resources for worship. But Samuel recognized that the argument missed the central issue. External acts of devotion could not compensate for a pattern of disregarding clear responsibilities. The confrontation culminated in a devastating announcement. Because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord, he would no longer establish a lasting dynasty over Israel. Once again, the emphasis falls on continuity rather than immediate removal. Saul remained king, but the future had changed. The monarchy would continue. Yet, it would eventually pass to another family. From a historical perspective, this moment represents one of the most significant transitions in the narrative. The first king of Israel had not failed because of military weakness or administrative incompetence. He failed because the qualities that made him effective were no longer balanced by restraint. The ability to act decisively became impatience. Confidence became self-trust. Political judgment began replacing covenant accountability. For Samuel, the situation carried a deeply personal dimension. This was not merely a constitutional crisis. He had guided Saul from the beginning, witnessed his rise, and hoped the monarchy would flourish under his leadership. The disappointment described in the biblical narrative reflects more than disagreement. It reflects the tragedy of unrealized potential. Saul possessed many of the characteristics necessary for success. Yet the very system Samuel helped establish now faced uncertainty because its first king had misunderstood the nature of authority. Leadership, the story suggests, is not ultimately tested by how much power a person acquires. It is tested by how that person responds once power has been acquired. As Samuel departed from the king, a new reality emerged. Saul still sat on the throne. The nation still recognized him as ruler, yet the future was already moving in a different direction. Somewhere beyond the royal court, another leader was being prepared, one whose rise would begin with a lesson that stood in sharp contrast to everything that had gone wrong in Saul's reign. The rejection of Saul's dynasty created a problem far larger than the fate of a single ruler. Israel now faced a period of uncertainty unlike any it had experienced before. The nation had demanded a monarchy to secure stability, continuity, and long-term leadership. Yet the first king had already demonstrated serious flaws, and Samuel had announced that his line would not endure. From a political perspective, the situation was potentially dangerous. Ancient kingdoms often depended upon clear succession. Questions about the future could easily produce instability, rivalries, and conflict. Yet while the public narrative remained focused on Saul's reign, another story was quietly beginning beyond the attention of the royal court. One of the most fascinating characteristics of biblical history is the way major transitions often develop long before they become visible. New leaders frequently emerge in unexpected places, while existing systems still appear secure. The next chapter in Israel's story would begin in a small Judean town far removed from the centers of national power. It would begin not with a military commander, a wealthy aristocrat, or an influential politician, but with a shepherd. The chapter opens with Samuel grieving over Saul. This detail is important because it reveals the human dimension of the story. Samuel had not opposed the monarchy itself. He had worked tirelessly to guide its creation and support its success. Saul's failures, therefore, represented more than a political disappointment. They represented the collapse of hopes Samuel had invested years helping to build. The biblical narrative portrays his grief as genuine and prolonged, yet eventually he received a direct instruction. The time for mourning had passed. A new mission awaited him. God commanded Samuel to travel to Bethlehem and visit a man named Jesse because the future king would come from among his sons. The assignment immediately created tension. Saul remained on the throne. Publicly searching for another king could easily be interpreted as rebellion. Samuel understood the risk and expressed concern about how Saul might react if the mission became known. This concern highlights an important change in Israel's political environment. The monarchy had introduced new realities into national life. Power now existed in a centralized form, and challenges to that power could carry serious consequences. God provided Samuel with a practical reason for his journey, allowing him to travel under the pretense of participating in a sacrificial gathering. The arrangement was legitimate, but it concealed a purpose known only to a few individuals. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, Samuel's presence immediately attracted attention. The town elders approached him cautiously and asked whether he had come in peace. Their reaction reveals the influence Samuel still possessed. By this stage of his life, his visits were rarely viewed as routine events. People understood that significant developments often followed wherever he appeared. After reassuring them, Samuel invited Jesse and his family to participate in the sacrificial ceremony. What followed became one of the most important selection scenes in the entire Old Testament. As Jesse's sons passed before him, Samuel naturally focused on the qualities most people associate with leadership. The first son, Eliab, immediately impressed him. His appearance, confidence, and stature seemed to match expectations formed during Saul's reign. From a human perspective, he looked like a king. The reaction is understandable. Throughout history, societies have often connected leadership with visible characteristics. Height, physical presence, charisma, and outward confidence frequently shape first impressions. Yet the narrative deliberately challenges this tendency. Samuel's initial judgment proved incorrect. One after another, Jesse's sons appeared before him, one after another. They were passed over. The repetition builds dramatic tension while emphasizing a broader theme. Conventional assumptions about leadership were being questioned. The process was not simply eliminating candidates. It was exposing the limitations of human evaluation. Eventually, Samuel realized that none of the sons standing before him had been chosen. Confused, he asked whether another remained. Jesse responded that his youngest son was absent because he was tending sheep. The detail may seem minor, but its significance is profound. David had not even been considered important enough to attend the gathering. While his brothers participated in the ceremony, he continued performing routine agricultural responsibilities. In the social hierarchy of the ancient world, shepherding occupied a relatively humble position. Shepherds spent long periods away from population centers, often performing physically demanding work with little public recognition. Nothing about David's circumstances suggested future kingship. Yet, biblical narratives repeatedly demonstrate a willingness to challenge assumptions about where leadership originates. The person overlooked by nearly everyone else would become the central figure of Israel's future. When David finally arrived, the atmosphere of the story changed immediately. Samuel received confirmation that this was the individual he had been sent to find. He then took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his family. Unlike Saul's public selection at Mizpah, this event occurred quietly. There were no national celebrations, no official announcements, and no immediate transfer of authority. In fact, years would pass before David approached the throne. This distinction is crucial because it prevents readers from viewing the anointing as a simple political appointment. The event marked the beginning of preparation, rather than the completion of a transition. David was chosen long before he would rule. The biblical narrative also notes a significant contrast unfolding beneath the surface. As David's story began to move forward, Saul's reign entered a period of increasing instability. The juxtaposition is intentional. One leader was rising while another was declining, yet the story avoids simplistic comparisons. David is not presented as a flawless replacement, nor is Saul reduced to a caricature. Instead, the narrative invites readers to consider a deeper question. What qualities should define leadership? The chapter offers several clues. David's selection does not emphasize wealth, status, military experience, or political connections. None of those factors explain why he was chosen. Instead, the story repeatedly directs attention toward character, potential, and internal qualities not immediately visible to observers. Historians often note that many transformative leaders initially emerge from unexpected backgrounds. The biblical narrative develops a similar idea but places it within a theological framework. Human societies naturally focus on visible indicators of success. While God's purposes often unfold through individuals others fail to notice. This perspective helps explain why Bethlehem occupies such an important place in the story. At the time, it was a relatively small settlement with little political significance. Yet, it became the starting point for a dynasty that would eventually dominate Israel's history. For Samuel, the mission represented another defining moment in a life already filled with historic transitions. He had witnessed the collapse of the old sanctuary leadership. He had guided national renewal at Mizpah. He had overseen the birth of the monarchy. Now, he quietly initiated the process that would shape its future. Yet, unlike political strategists focused on securing influence, Samuel's role remained remarkably consistent. He served as the instrument through which transitions occurred, rather than the beneficiary of those transitions. As he departed Bethlehem, outward appearances suggested that nothing had changed. Saul remained king. David returned to his responsibilities. Daily life continued. Yet, beneath the surface, the future had already begun to shift. The next great chapter of Israel's history was no longer a distant possibility. It was quietly growing in the fields surrounding Bethlehem, waiting for the moment when it would step onto the national stage. As the story of Samuel approaches its conclusion, one fact becomes increasingly clear. Few individuals in Israel's history influenced so many major transitions while holding so little conventional power. Samuel never sat on a throne. He never founded a royal dynasty. He never commanded vast armies or built a political empire. Yet, from the final years of the judges to the rise of the monarchy, his presence can be found at nearly every decisive turning point. He witnessed the decline of Shiloh, the collapse of Eli's household, the national renewal at Mizpah, the emergence of Israel's first king, the failure of Saul's dynasty, and the secret anointing of David. Entire generations experienced history through events Samuel helped shape. By the time his life neared its end, Israel itself had been transformed. The fragmented tribal society described at the beginning of this story no longer existed in the same form. A new political order had emerged, and the foundations of Israel's future were already being laid. Against this backdrop, the biblical narrative records Samuel's death with remarkable simplicity. Yet, behind that simplicity stands one of the most significant legacies in the Old Testament. The account appears in 1 Samuel chapter 25. Unlike the dramatic scenes that characterize many of the book's major events, the announcement is brief. Samuel died, and all Israel gathered to mourn him. He was buried at his home in Ramah. At first glance, the description may seem almost understated. There are no lengthy speeches, no elaborate royal ceremonies, and no extended accounts of national mourning. Yet, the very wording of the passage reveals something extraordinary. The text states that all Israel mourned. In a nation frequently divided by tribal interests, regional loyalties, and political disagreements, such a statement carries significant weight. Samuel had become one of the rare figures respected across the entire country. His influence transcended local affiliations because his role had never been confined to a single tribe or region. For decades, he had functioned as a unifying presence during some of the most turbulent years in Israel's history. His death, therefore, represented more than the loss of a respected leader. It marked the passing of a generation. To understand Samuel's legacy, it is important to consider not only what he accomplished, but also the unique position he occupied within Israel's development. Earlier chapters explored how he helped guide the nation through recovery after the Ark crisis, and how he established patterns of leadership that brought greater stability to tribal society. Yet, his importance extends beyond individual achievements. Samuel stands at the intersection of multiple institutions that shaped Israel's identity. He grew up within the priestly environment of Shiloh, served as a judge during the final phase of the tribal period, emerged as a nationally recognized prophetic figure, and oversaw the establishment of the monarchy. Few biblical characters connect so many dimensions of Israel's history. Most leaders belong clearly to a particular era. Samuel belongs to several. This is one reason historians and biblical scholars continue to view him as one of the pivotal figures in the transition from early Israel to the kingdom period. Another aspect of his legacy involves the development of prophetic leadership. Long before famous figures such as Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel appeared, Samuel helped establish the credibility and national importance of the prophetic office. His authority did not depend upon royal appointment or military success. It rested on public trust and perceived integrity. This distinction became increasingly important as kings gained political power. Samuel's career demonstrated that national leadership could not be reduced to government alone. Moral and spiritual accountability remained essential. Later prophets would challenge kings, confront injustice, and call the nation back to its covenant responsibilities. In many respects, Samuel helped create the conditions that allowed those voices to be heard. His influence, therefore, continued long after his own lifetime ended. Equally important was his contribution to Israel's understanding of leadership. Throughout the story, Samuel repeatedly appears as a figure more interested in stewardship than self-advancement. He confronted corruption when it appeared in Eli's household. He warned the nation about the risks associated with monarchy, even when doing so proved unpopular. He challenged Saul despite the political dangers involved. He carried out the mission to Bethlehem, even though it required courage and discretion. In each case, his decisions were shaped by responsibility rather than personal gain. This characteristic distinguishes him from many political figures throughout history. Samuel's authority grew because he consistently treated leadership as a trust rather than a possession. The contrast becomes especially striking when compared with Saul's story. Saul's greatest struggles emerged after acquiring power. Samuel's reputation endured because power was never his primary objective. His life, therefore, offers a different model of influence, one based not on domination, but on service. The significance of Samuel's legacy also appears within the broader biblical canon. Centuries after his death, his name continued to be remembered among Israel's most important spiritual leaders. Psalm 99 places Samuel alongside Moses and Aaron as figures who called upon the Lord and received divine answers. The reference is remarkable because it associates him with two of the most foundational leaders in Israel's history. The prophet Jeremiah later invoked Samuel's name as an example of powerful intercession, demonstrating that his reputation remained influential generations after he lived, even in the New Testament. The Epistle to the Hebrews reflects a tradition that remembers the prophets of Israel as examples of enduring faith, a legacy within which Samuel occupies a significant place. These later references reveal that Samuel's impact was not limited to the events recorded in 1 Samuel. His memory became part of Israel's ongoing understanding of faithful leadership and covenant responsibility. Yet, perhaps the most important lesson from Samuel's life lies in the cumulative effect of seemingly ordinary acts of faithfulness. When viewed individually, many of his actions appear modest. A child serving in a sanctuary, a young assistant responding to a voice in the night, a leader traveling between towns to resolve disputes, a prophet delivering difficult messages, a mentor guiding a nation through political change. None of these moments alone explain his enduring influence. The power of Samuel's story emerges through consistency. Over decades, he repeatedly accepted responsibilities others might have avoided. He adapted to changing circumstances without abandoning core convictions. He remained engaged during periods of uncertainty when many leaders would have retreated. History often celebrates dramatic victories and charismatic personalities, but Samuel's life suggests that long-term faithfulness may shape the future just as profoundly as spectacular achievements. By the time of his death, the next chapter of Israel's history was already unfolding. David had been anointed. Saul's reign was entering its final phase. New conflicts and opportunities awaited the nation. Samuel would not live to witness those developments, yet his influence remained woven into all of them. The monarchy that emerged carried marks of his guidance. The prophetic tradition that flourished afterward reflected principles he helped establish. The national identity strengthened during his lifetime continued to shape future generations. In many ways, Samuel accomplished something few leaders ever achieve. He prepared Israel not only for the challenges of his own era, but also for challenges he would never personally see. His story began with a mother's prayer during a time of national uncertainty. It ended with a nation mourning the loss of one of its most trusted leaders. Between those two moments stands a life that helped redirect the course of Israel's history. Samuel never wore a crown, yet the future of kings passed through his hands. He never founded a dynasty, yet dynasties were shaped by his decisions. He never sought greatness, yet his legacy endured for centuries. That legacy remains one of the clearest examples in Scripture of how a single life, devoted to responsibility, integrity, and service, can influence the destiny of an entire nation.